Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marlene Lawel. I'm the director of the Central Asia program here at JW, and it's just a great pleasure, I guess, for all of us to see a full room for an event on Tajikistan. That's really, I think, a great recognition for the country to see how people really care in DC about the importance of the country. And here at the GW Central Asia program, we really try now to develop events that are really looking only at one country in Central Asia each time, because we really consider that the 5 of them are becoming so different. I mean, it's a kind of elephant in the room, but that's always good to repeat it, that they are so different, following such divergent political, socio-economic, cultural path, that it's really good to have events that are devoted only to one and not to the region as a whole. So we already had several events on Kazakhstan. We are very happy to have today this event on Tajikistan. On April the 6th, we will have a one-day devoted to Uzbekistan, and in May we will have a one-day devoted to Turkmenistan. And we hope to have something on just on Kyrgyzstan probably in September or October. So that's a kind of series where we are looking really to each country individually. And Tajikistan, I think, is really facing a lot of change. As you know, it's a very young society, so of course demographically many things are changing, because the youth is really the majority of the population now. It also faced a parliamentary election a few days ago. The killing of Umar Ali Kuvatov a few days ago was also, of course, a kind of big event for the political landscape in the region and the way people perceive it. The discussion about integrating the Eurasian Economic Union is also a kind of big agenda, and maybe even bigger one is the Russian economic crisis currently ongoing and its impact on labor migration, and how the households in Tajikistan are already affected and will be affected in the months to come by the crisis. And globally, the role of Islam in Tajik society is really probably one of the most fast driver of change that we can see in the country. So that just to give an overview of the things we will be discussing today. We will have a first panel looking at the kind of economic and political situation, and a second panel that will be really devoted on the role of Islam and the changing role of Islam in Tajik society. But before that, we will have a keynote speech, and I'm very happy here to have with us Professor Eric McGlinchey from George Mason University. Professor McGlinchey is Associate Professor of Politics at George Mason, and he's the author of a very famous kind of reference book on Central Asia, Chaos, Violence, Dynasty, Politics and Islam in Central Asia, which has been published by Pittsburgh University Press in 2011. Eric has been working a lot on Tajikistan this last year, and that would be really great to have his perspective on how things are changing in the region. So Eric, I would like to give you the floor, and then you can manage kind of short Q&A session at the end of your speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, Marlene. I'd like to thank the Central Asia program here at GW for inviting me. I'd like to thank all of you for coming on this rainy day to talk about Tajikistan. The timing, I think, of the panel, as Marlene has already suggested, is good, although not always for good reasons. Now, at least my perception here as a scholar in Washington, it's a time that's similar to the days immediately following 9/11 over a decade ago. And what I mean here is the perceptions of fear, of concern, of worry about Islam and its role have taken on, I think, a new heightened level that we haven't seen for quite some time. And there's reason for this. The atrocities that ISIS is committing are scary. The Paris bombing demonstrated that these things are not distant events, but can happen quote unquote, in Western capitals at home, right? So it's hitting a nerve which we here in the United States haven't perceived for quite some time. And my concern, and this is a concern based on an observation when I first came to the area, Northern Virginia, in 2006, is that with heightened worries about Islam come new lenses, sometimes narrow lenses, with which we view Islam. There's sometimes a rush to attribute to Islam some kind of causality, some kind of perception of militancy, which maybe in some cases is justified, but the central idea that I would like to leave you with today is that in many cases it isn't justified. And what I'd like to do is use a wide lens to look at Islam in Tajikistan over the past 25 years, and using this wide lens suggests to you that fears about radicalization and militancy in Tajikistan with regards to Islam are likely overblown. One note about Kuwait, Marlene already brought this up. The 24 movement was labeled an extremist movement by the Tajik government. This is just the most recent example of how we see this rhetoric applied, I think sometimes inaccurately, maybe even for instrumental reasons, against what is not an Islamist opposition, but rather a political opposition. The parliamentary elections that you mentioned, I know we're going to talk about this, I think in the first panel there'll be a discussion of this, but these were elections that yielded only pro-presidential parties. The only Islamic party in Central Asia, indeed for the former Soviet Union, the IRPT, didn't cross the 5% threshold. So the space for discussing Islam or Islam as an organizing principle in Tajikistan is shrinking. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind here, and I think we have to be very careful with how we view Islam in Tajikistan and not jump into some of the rhetoric that is coming not only from the Tajik government, but I'll illustrate in a second, also other governments, including my own. What I'd like to do is first address this fear of radical Islam and give you an example of where some of this discourse is emerging. The second thing I'd like to do is provide this broader view of Islam in Tajikistan by looking at three events, three phenomena that are typically portrayed as potentially militant, right? And this is the Tajik Civil War, the Rash Valley events of 2010, and Harod 2012. These are all events that have had elements of militant Islam, radical Islam, foisted upon them in interpretations, particularly interpretations by the Tajik government. And lastly, I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts about U.S. engagement of Tajik state and society in light of this lens that I'm providing, this lens that suggests perhaps we're not looking at radical Islam or even the threat of radical Islam, but rather a government that is instrumentally leveling the charge of radical Islam for instrumental reasons. Okay. Congratulations on International Women's Day. This is not a gratuitous Women's Day picture. There's a reason why I have this here. President Rahman gave an interesting speech a couple days ago. It's actually 2 days before International Women's Day. I guess it's Mother's Day in Tajikistan. And I'll just read a couple outtakes from that speech because I think it's instructive of the broader phenomena that I'm discussing here. He said, quote, "Do the mothers of those misled persons or they themselves not know that the place of such young people is hell? Do they not know that Syria and Iraq are Muslim countries and the greater proportion of the people who are dying every day are Muslims? I reiterate that indifference of families and society to such a plague of the century will have dire consequences. We must strictly control our children. If we don't, we will have dire consequences.
We can't allow them to be misled by propaganda and extremist groups or join extremist and terrorist groups and betray their homeland and become killers. An interesting speech to give on Mother's Day. Of course, he's referring to the idea that young Tajik men are traveling to Syria to fight for ISIS. The Tajik government has said between 200 and 300 Tajiks are fighting in Syria, that 50 Tajiks have already been killed in this fight. It's already brought at least 25 charges against Tajiks for participating or trying to participate in the Syrian conflict, and has detained at least another 150 people. So this is very much on the radar of the Tajik government. And to a certain extent, it's also on the radar of the US government. And here I just reference a quote from Ambassador Blake, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia, Central Asia, and South Asia. He begins, this is a quote from 2013, he says, "The limited threat currently posed by Islamic militancy in Central Asia and the failure of radical ideology to take root are no reason for complacency." So it might be limited now, but be careful. Central Asian states face real security challenges, not only from violent extremists, but also from cross-border threats such as drug trafficking and organized crime. So Blake is saying that the threat isn't pronounced now, but there's potential. And I would disagree both with Blake and with the Tajik president and say that the threats are a bit overblown. And let me just run you through 3 events that will help you understand, or you probably, actually, most of you probably understand far better than I do. I'll be perfectly blunt. I don't claim any unique knowledge. My only unique knowledge is as a scholar who interacts frequently with the DC policy community. But 3 events that would suggest that really this is overblown. This is really overblown. First, again, is the Tajik Civil War. And I'll talk about Rashid Valley 2010 and Paro 2012. So the Tajik Civil War. Now, I'll be perfectly honest that there were Islamists who were engaged in the Tajik Civil War. The only challenge is they were Uzbek. So Tahir Yaldash, Juma Namangani, these are militant Islamists. They got chased out of Uzbekistan in March 1992. They found refuge in Tajikistan. They joined the UTO. They fought alongside a wide group of oppositionists who were challenging the Tajik government. After the Civil War, they remained in Tajikistan. They used Tajikistan as a base for staging incursions into Uzbekistan. And they were evacuated in 2000 with the help of the Tajik government, with the Minister of Emergencies in 2000, evacuated to Afghanistan. So I don't deny that there are some militants who have been in Tajikistan. There's other militants who I'm not talking about, but yeah, there are a handful of people. What I think is interesting, though, is if you look at the primary protagonist of one of the primary protagonists of the Civil War. If you look at the Islamic Renaissance Party, at the very time Namangani and Yaldash were becoming more extremist, that is, these Uzbek militants who based in Tajikistan were becoming more extremist, the IRPT was becoming secular. Right? So if you look at the charter of the Islamic Renaissance Party, the 1999 charter, it stipulated that should it win elections, which of course they would never win, right? But were it to win elections, it would not seek to replace the secular government with an Islamist government. And if you look at the statements made by the IRP consistently over the past 16 years, that message is clear. That there's no effort here to establish some kind of Islamist government. Rather, this is a party that operates within the bounds of secularism. So, yes, there were people during the Civil War who were united by this party, the IRPT. They engaged in militancy, but there was a lot of people. There were Democrats, right, quote unquote Democrats, who fought the government as well. So I think it would be a mistake to look at the Tajik Civil War as one of a secular autocratic government fighting a religious militant group. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. regional identities, as I'll talk next about the Rosh Valley and Harog, had a huge role in what was going on here. Okay, so Exhibit 1, unlikely to, I think it's unlikely that this was an example of Islamism, despite the way it's been portrayed by several folks. Rosh Valley, 2010. Just a little bit of background. Again, most of you know this far better than I. In September 2010, militants in the Rosh Valley killed 26 government soldiers. These indeed were militants. There's no doubt about the fact that these were armed men who killed government soldiers. These armed men had escaped from a jail, maximum security prison in Dushanbe, the preceding month. They had been charged with being members of the IMU and seeking to topple the Rahman government. Digging a little bit deeper, if you look at the government narrative, the leader of these militants, a man named Davlatov, is a very well-known warlord. His brother had been detained the previous month and had said that his brother was running, was running a terrorist training camp and was being aided by foreign mercenaries. So the Davlatov's brother confessed and said that yes, we were up to no good. If you look at people who've done a lot of research on the ground, I'm thinking of work, for example, by John Heathershaw and Sophie Roche, who worked in the Rosh Valley and talked to people about what happened here. The impression that a lot of people have come away with was this wasn't about Islamist militancy by any stretch of the imagination. Rather, this was about who controlled the region at the local level. There had been a unwritten but very much understood agreement between people like Davlatov and other warlords and the central government that there were spheres of influence within Tajikistan. And Rahman at the time was trying to rewrite this agreement and extend central control over the region. And a lot of people will argue that this, particularly at the local level, a lot of people argue this was the reason for the clash. It wasn't Islamism by any stretch of the imagination. It was a battle over who controlled territory, revenues at the local level. Harog is very much the same thing. If you look at the events of Harog in 2012, the narrative here, at least the one offered by the government, is not dissimilar to the one in Rosh Valley. Here, 17 government soldiers, 30 militants died in Harog in July 2012. The best we can tell, the spark that led to the conflict was the killing of General Nazarov. I did some work in Harog, not last summer, fortunately. It would probably be a little sticky if I was working in Harog last summer, but the previous summer. And the narrative that I heard from most people in Harog was General Nazarov was drunk. So it was an incident that happened close to the Ishkashim border and had treated local warlords, for lack of a better term, poorly in an encounter. And that encounter led to a fight, which led to Nazarov being killed. That's the local narrative. I mean, we can dispute that. If you look at the Western narrative about this, a lot of people will say that this was a fight over the Ishkashim border and who controlled the drug trade, and that Dushanbe was trying to reassert control over the border and capture the revenues that coming from the drug trade. In my work in Harog, I didn't get much on this. Granted, I suppose most people, if they had knowledge, probably wouldn't want to tell me that this is what was going on. So I concede that point. But what I did find interesting about this experience was when you spoke to people in Harog, there was immense pride in the protests of July 23rd. Protests where people perceive that the pressure that the population exerted encouraged, indeed forced, the government troops back into the barracks. So it wasn't fighting between Ayubekov and the government troops. So rather it was the mass protests that followed the fighting that drove the government troops back into the barracks. And this was indicative of a much larger phenomenon of who really was the just ruler in Harog, in Gorno-Badakhshan. And the idea here is that, again, the government had violated the unwritten contract of local rule, had tried to reassert power, and the citizens of Haroog and Balikeshan had pushed the government away. The government said that this was not the case, that really what was going on was that Ayımbekov had partnered with Afghan Islamists and was receiving tens of millions of dollars from abroad to destabilize the government. So that was the government narrative. So you can see the two different sides that are coming here, just as we saw the two different sides in the Tajik Civil War, the two different sides in Rosh Valley 2010, and here again in Haroog in 2012. Okay, so what's to be done? Right? What's the U.S. government to do here? I mean, I suppose the U.S. government is somewhat tangential to this whole issue. The main point I want to leave you with is, again, we rush to label these things militant Islam, and I think if you look at it more carefully, these are far from militant Islam. But the U.S. government has a sense that it can intervene to a certain extent and intervene for the better. The U.S. government produces an interesting document called the Guide to Drivers of Violent Extremism, and this is something that the U.S. government it does studies on violent extremism in all the places where it's operating to see whether or not it can continue operating. But this guide highlights 7 political drivers that we should be paying particular attention to, because if these drivers are present, the guide instructs that there is the potential. There is the potential for a movement towards radicalization and violent extremism. And let me just highlight these 7 for you. The first is a denial of political rights and civil liberties. Violation of human rights is the second. Widespread government corruption. The presence of ungoverned territories. A history of prior militant conflict. External state support for domestic violent extremist groups. And lastly, illegitimate yet unchallenged national governments. Uh-oh. Right? Let's run through the empirics, right, of the Tajik case. Denial of political rights and civil liberties. If you look at, there's many of these indices out there. Massachusetts Freedom House for a shorthand. Tajikistan consistently has rated as not free by all the measures of political rights and civil liberties that Freedom House scores countries on. Violations of human rights. I'll just run through a few. Islamic groups are banned from organizing in Tajikistan. HT, no matter what you think about HT was banned in 2000. Tablighi Jamaat was banned in 2006. Salafism was made illegal in 2009. And then the most interesting one of all, the law on parental responsibility passed in August 2011, which had as its goal preventing youth from going to mosque in Tajikistan. So, violation of human rights. I mean, if you view religion as a fundamental human right, or the right to practice religion, I think here we have evidence of violation of human rights. Corruption. I was gonna share some personal examples, but I'd probably better not. I'll just give you the Transparency International rating of Tajikistan. Tajikistan ranks 152nd out of 175 countries as far as corruption. So being higher up on the TI scale is if you're against corruption, being higher up is not a good thing. Shares company with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan as being very corrupt. A study by the World Bank, which is actually a little bit more rigorous than the TI study, where they interviewed businesses, found that 60% of all businesses reported that government corruption was a significant obstacle for conducting their business in Tajikistan. So, corrupt country for sure. Presence of ungoverned territories. Except for Dushanbe, this is what Tajikistan is, right? I mean, there's a lot of ungoverned territories in Tajikistan. I think the Rasht events and the Haroog events, actually, they're not ungoverned. They're just not governed by Rahman, or governed particularly well, or they're contested, right? So, but certainly presence of ungoverned territories. History of prior conflict, I think the Civil War, here we have that. Illegitimate yet unchallenged national government. I think we saw that in spades with the March 1st parliamentary elections. There was no opposition party that got into parliament. I suppose you could say the opposition is just really weak. Then that begs the question, well, why is the opposition really weak? Maybe because they're chasing the opposition out of the country and killing members of the opposition. So the one thing that's not, to my knowledge, present, although the Tajik government would claim otherwise, is external support for violent extremist groups. I haven't seen any evidence of that, although I know, particularly in the Haro case, the government claimed that that indeed was present. I personally have not come across evidence of that. Okay, so what should the United States government do? I mean, these are just a few very basic suggestions. And these are things that if you're in the US government, you'd say, well, we're already doing, and to a certain extent, yes, but I would argue that there's a lot of room for doing more of this. Support for political parties. One of the fundamental challenges that the opposition faces in Tajikistan is actually organizing and getting clear platforms, the mechanics of creating political parties. The U.S. government has certainly considerable experience trying to promote this. Not much of this has been done in Tajikistan, partly because it's been hard to get in. But this is something that can, I think, productively be expanded. Encouraging government decentralization. And here, the encouraging is actually encouraging the central government to accept government decentralization that already exists. It's already there. So perhaps institutionalizing this and making it more legitimate rather than contested. And then lastly, I would say walking back the recent attack on religious freedoms that we've seen on the part of the Dushanbe government. If you read a lot of the local press, the independent press, many people are beginning to say that Tajikistan, the government's policy towards Islam, is becoming uncomfortably close to what we've seen over the past 15, 20 years of the Uzbek government's policy towards Islam. Moving in that direction, and I think, in the case of Uzbekistan, the government actually has guns to reinforce repression. In the case of Tajikistan, the government doesn't have the repressive capacity to pursue that kind of policy. So repression of religious groups without the capacity to repress militant groups is a dangerous combination. I think particularly in Tajikistan, particularly given the history of civil war. So again, if you look over the past 25 years, very little evidence to suggest that there is militancy. If you look objectively at drivers of militancy, many of them are present in Tajikistan, so there's potential for militancy, and addressing those drivers, I think, would preclude future developments of radical Islam in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for this great keynote speech. Let's open the floor. We have like 20 minutes for discussion, so please just don't hesitate, questions, comments, and introduce yourself first. Yes.
Bakhtiyor Safarov. I represent Central Asia Consulting. Excellent presentation. It's probably you covered all history and all details. That was really good. My question would be, what's from your perspective, why it's taking so long for, particularly for Western countries, to realize those facts? Like, identify the Islamic opposition, democratic opposition, because that's the whole picture that you're describing right now, it was in the 90s. So why do you think it's taking so long for Western countries to realize this whole history, the whole picture of the situation that's going on right now?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. I actually thought in the 90s, particularly 95 to 97, 95 to 98, there was a fair amount of recognition of this. I was encouraged by the United Nations peace process and the level of detail that Western countries, together with their Tajik counterparts, the level of detail and recognition that indeed this wasn't a case of Islamist militancy. So much so that everybody was comfortable with having the IRPT as part of the peace negotiation, as part of, and being institutionalized in the next government, right? So I think the question is you know, what happened since 1997? Right? So why in the past 15, almost 20 years now, has the West kind of backed away from this? I mean, I would say it's not universal, right? If you look at U.S. foreign policy, if you look at people who study Tajikistan within the U.S. government, there's a lot of recognition of exactly the things that I've said. It's just policy itself hasn't been particularly nuanced. And I think you probably can answer this as well as I can. There's been certain demands on U.S. foreign policy, particularly what's going on in Afghanistan, that the attention and I think the resolve to focus on what's going on in Tajikistan just hasn't been there. Tajikistan played an important but not a particularly large role in the U.S. effort in Afghanistan. When you contrast that to Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan in 2001, 2005, those were countries that played very important roles. The Tajik role was less, and I just think it kind of went to the back burner for the U.S. government. Now I think it's beginning to assume increasing importance. I think Marlene's right. The fact that we have such a large audience today suggests that people are interested in Tajikistan and people are concerned. So I'm hoping that there will be a renewed interest. But I think the explanation is probably the geopolitical concerns, the immediate challenges of Afghanistan and Iraq over the past 15 years.
Yes.
Vladimir Fedorenko, the Think Institute. Nice to say again, beautiful presentation. My question is about, in the light of candidacy to the Eurasian Union, to the Eurasian community, do you think consideration, you mentioned about the lack of proper arms in order to counteract any radical activity, possible radical activity in the country, do you think that for the elites in that country, this is one of the considerations in terms of the securitization of the governance by the way of joining and having the common interest of the more stronger allies in the area?
Good to see you. I think it wouldn't be exaggeration to say that there is a autocratic club that is emerging in Central Asia, right? So there are a lot of these governments have shared interests in preventing the uprisings that we saw in North Africa, the uprisings that we saw in 2005 and 2010 in Kyrgyzstan, and there are a group of countries that find it expedient, when I say countries, it's a group of governments that find it expedient to come together and work against these kinds of eventualities or potentialities, right? So I think you're right. I think the union offers some support. I'm not quite sure how robust that support would actually be, but some support, some defense against such uprisings. You know, that said, I don't mean to paint Tajikistan as being particularly nefarious and Russia as being particularly nefarious. If you look at Uzbekistan, one of the largest shipments of military equipment that Uzbekistan has received in the past decade just came from the United States, right? There's a desire among all of these governments to build up capacity to fight. I mean, actually, where I differ with you is capacity. You said radical Islam. My sense is that the desire is not to fight radical Islamists, but rather to fight the opposition, right? So that they're seeking these connections, they're seeking this equipment, not so much because they're scared about radical Islam or militant Islam, but they're concerned about domestic opposition, right? So why would you go after Kubatov? Now, I mean, I don't know who went after Kubatov, but why is this person problematic? He's problematic not because he's an Islamist, but rather because he's an oppositionist. And it's these kinds of folk that I think have the government most worried, not the Islamists.
If I may, I have a question that is in a sense following Vladimir's one. How would you address this kind of puzzle situation where we describe Tajikistan as both weak and strong state? So it's a weak state, almost a failing state in terms of providing state support, welfare state, I mean the distribution of wealth, and at the same time, it's a strong state in terms of its ability to repress. And so I was wondering how, I mean, especially when you try to look at the US engagement, I mean, how do we contribute to reinforcing state capabilities without reinforcing this repressive version of the state and not contributing to delegitimizing which is already the weak part of the state? I mean, how do we manage this vision of being both a strong and a weak state? And what does that mean also for the fact that on 8 million population, if you have 1 million abroad, and they are the kind of core of the population, like young males, what does that mean in terms of the capability of the state structure of controlling just the future of the society? I mean, how a state can address the fact that you have this kind of core population outside of state control? How does that play against this strong versus weak kind of nature, double nature of the state?
Thanks, Melanie, for the question. I actually don't see Tajikistan and Tajik government as strong at all, and almost on no grounds as strong. It has very weak repressive capacity. Yeah, sure, it can mobilize troops, but it doesn't mobilize them particularly well. And they get chased out by local.
Immobilized elections, immobilized repression on mosque. I mean.
Right. So some things are relatively straightforward for weak governments to do. So it's relatively straightforward to have election fraud. Look, if the Kyrgyz state can have election fraud, then just about any state can have election fraud. So it doesn't take a lot to manipulate things like that. It takes a lot more to do the kind of things like we saw in Azerbaijan in 2005. And the one thing that we know about repression is if it's going to be effective, it has to be extreme, intense, and brutal. And I don't think the Tajik government can do that right now. I mean, the bigger question is it a good policy on, say, Western governments' parts to work with the Tajik state as it currently is to build its capacity? And my answer to that would be no. I view the current Rahman government as hopeless, is not capable of reform. And even if the president wanted to reform, the system is so entrenched and the patronage networks are so entrenched that you look at Gorbachev, 1989, the moment you try to reform it, then you're gone. So I think the bigger question is, can you work to build the capacity of the Tajik state? My answer would be no, not in the current structure of the Tajik state. Rather, what you can do is you can work with the opposition, or you can work with civil society, you can work with watchdog groups that fight against corruption, but trying to build the capacity of the Tajik state at this point is a fool's errand.
Yeah, Sébastien Pérouse, I'm working here at the Central Asia Program. I can't remember exactly when that was. I guess it was a few months ago, 1 year ago. But Dushanbe was considering a bill. To restrict the funds of the NGOs. I mean, to control much more NGO spending. Did you have some information on that? Are there some new rules? I know. Would be interesting.
Yeah, I would be interested in knowing more about this as well. I mean, there's been a process in Central Asia across the board where they've been following the Russian model with lots of NGOs. I don't have the specifics on that. I don't know if anyone has specifics on that, but I don't know. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Yes.
I'm Amy Bernath with Pyrex. So you just made this comment that any capacity assistance to the Tajik government, in your view, is a fool's errand. My impression is that, at least for USG, they're not totally at the point of agreeing with you on that, maybe. That the overarching foreign policy goal might informally be preventing Tajikistan from becoming a failed state, and the idea is that it's not there, and Rahman is bad, but the idea of anything else is scarier. Does that position prevent the US government from being proactive enough around the points on your slide and sort of the points 1 through 5 of what we understand to be the actual drivers of the extremist movements?
I don't envy people in the US government who have to work with Tajikistan, right? I mean, I mean, that's what governments do. They work with other governments, right? So the U.S. government doesn't have the option of sitting back and saying this is a fool's errand because they have to engage. I mean, I think the question is along what lines do you engage, there are lots of different kinds of programming that the U.S. government can do, other than programming that would buttress the Rahman regime, buttress the patience networks of the Rahman regime. If I were strictly a foreign policy realist, and my concern was an unstable Tajikistan, I might buy the argument that you want to potentially strengthen the government to prevent that. At the same time, I don't think there's any amount of programming and assistance that can fix the pathologies of the current Rahman state. So I'm not quite sure on what ends you could work to strengthen this government. Whether or not the Rahman government collapses this is a dynamic that is internal to the Rahman government, which can't be influenced, I think, at this point by external assistance.
Visiting scholar from me, same view. My question is about Tajik militants fighting for ISIS. Can you please provide maybe a little bit information where exactly they recruited from? Because we know some, for example, Uzbeks get recruited a lot in Russia nowadays. So it's not very clear from the Tajikistan whether it's only most Tajikistan or Russia or any other countries. And maybe a little bit information about what drives them, what is the reason that drives Tajiks to join ISIS.
Right.
The no-age Central Asian countries. Thank you.
Yeah. I feel a little bit nervous talking about this because I know Marlene's here and she knows a lot more than I do on this question. I mean, the narrative that one hears, and I intentionally say the narrative that one hears. That's a hedge because I don't buy the narrative. But the narrative that one hears is that Tajik labor migrants go to Russia. They become radicalized, and then from Russia they go to Syria by way of Turkey, right? So that's the narrative that one hears a lot. Or Tajik labor migrants go to Turkey, and they somehow become radicalized in Turkey, and then they go across the border. There's anecdotal information on this. Understandably, it's hard. I mean, I don't know of any anthropologists or political scientists who are working with ISIS on the ground right now, so I'm not quite sure what the data is like. So what we have are anecdotal stories, often stories that are shared by the Tajik government. So the figures that I gave at the beginning of this presentation are Tajik government figures, right? It's the Interior Ministry of Tajikistan, or figures that we can get from Moscow, from the Russian government. But I have not seen compelling independent work that would suggest that these people are there in any great numbers. I mean, I have no doubt that there are probably some Tajiks, as I also would have no doubt that there are probably some Northern Virginians that are with ISIS right now. I just think we have to be careful of taking a few anecdotal examples and creating this big alarming picture when perhaps there's really no justification for a big alarming picture.
Yeah, ask a last question about when you said that because you are very pessimistic about the future of the regime itself, and therefore it would mean that it will collapse on one way or another, and you think it's mostly an internal dynamic. And I was wondering, how do you think? Because when you were discussing external actor, you mentioned mostly the US because that was the one you were looking at. What about Russia? I mean, how do you think? I mean, we know the Chinese position, which is like things can collapse. At least there is a partner with whom we can negotiate, things are fine, and then the domestic issues are let kind of for the control of the local people. What do you think would be the Russia? Because for Russia, it's more complicated. There is a real security engagement. There are troops on the ground. How do you think Russia could react or be prepared to think that could be coming on in Tajikistan? And if the Rahman government was to collapse, does that mean Russia would be supporting it, or the Russia will let things go and just look and be in a wait-and-see position? I mean, it's a kind of question impossible to answer because we cannot predict, but just globally, what do you think is the Russian position on that? Russia has been very ambiguous. I mean, they were very anti-Rahman, and yeah, at the same time supporting him, but the personal relation between Rahman and Putin are complicated and so on. So it would be interesting having your opinion.
Again, I think the Kyrgyz case is instructive here. I think if you look at 2005, Moscow wasn't particularly happy with that leadership change, and then if you look at 2010, the word on the street is maybe Russia had a pretty pronounced hand in what happened. Moscow certainly has the capacity to affect politics. I have not done a lot of research on. In Kyrgyzstan, I could say more definitively, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Russian money that is going into political party development in Kyrgyzstan. I know that for a fact because I've worked with the political parties that are being supported by Russia. I don't know as well the Tajik case. I would love to learn more, and I suspect we will learn more today. But that said, I mean, I think the one thing that's changed is what's happened in Ukraine and Russia's ability to manipulate the politics of Ukraine is a warning shot, I think, to all the former Soviet countries, with the potential exception of the Baltics, although we're not quite sure there, that if they don't fall in line, Moscow has no problem using dirty tricks to achieve the kinds of outcomes they would like to achieve. So I think the union is an example of that. The economic union is an example of Moscow's greater assertion of authority. The intervention in Kyrgyz politics is a clear example. Could similar thing happen in Tajikistan? I think sure, absolutely. And then of course there's always the challenge of the lever of labor migrants. Now Russia would be shooting itself in the foot if it were to prevent labor migration from Tajikistan. Russia desperately depends on labor migration from Tajikistan, but that's always a lever that Putin can use against Central Asian countries, but Tajikistan in particular.
Do we have last question? If not, so I think it was a great presentation. It just opened a lot of discussion about and food for thought about things we will be discussing more in depth during the two panels. So please join me in thanking our